5 smart tactics to leave an avoidant emotionally unsettled. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you gave your heart to someone, but the more you gave, the more they pulled away? You texted, no response. You opened up, they shut down. And you kept wondering, what the hell am I doing wrong? Listen to me. This isn't about you being too much. This isn't about you not being enough. This is about understanding a game that's being played and flipping the rules in your favor. Human beings crave certainty. Avoidance, even more. They love control. They expect you to reach out first, to be available, to chase. But what happens when you disrupt that pattern? You stop initiating. You stop responding immediately. You create space where they were once comfortable. Suddenly, the ground beneath them isn't so solid. And guess what? That gets their attention. Confidence is the biggest disruptor of an avoidance comfort zone. When you start walking into the room with an energy that says, I don't need you to validate me, it's like a psychological earthquake. They're used to partners who feel uncertain, who seek reassurance. But when you radiate self-assurance, that unsettles them because it's unfamiliar. And what's unfamiliar? It pulls people in. You've been the one giving, showing up, trying to make things work. Now, flip the script. Mirror their energy. If they go cold, you go colder. If they stop engaging, so do you. This isn't about playing games. It's about teaching people how to treat you. When you stop overextending, they're forced to feel the void they once assumed would always be filled. Here's the truth. People value what they have to work for. The moment you invest in your growth, your happiness, and your goals without centering them, you shift the dynamic. You become a force. And let me tell you something. When someone senses that they're losing something extraordinary, they start to question their choices. The ultimate move, walk away like you mean it. Not as a trick, not as a tactic, but because you know your worth. When you make peace with losing someone who doesn't meet you halfway, you become magnetic. And guess what? That's the moment they start to wonder if they made the wrong choice. Listen, you don't need to play small to get someone's attention. You don't need to beg for breadcrumbs of love. You are the whole damn feast. The moment you stop chasing and start living for yourself, everything changes. The real question is, are you ready to step into that power? Most people don't realize this, but human behavior is deeply rooted in patterns. We're wired to expect certain reactions, certain habits, certain responses. And when those expectations are met, we feel safe, we feel in control. But what happens when those expectations are suddenly shattered? What happens when the very thing someone thought was predictable disappears? That's when their mind wakes up. That's when the shift begins. Avoidants thrive on predictability. They rely on the idea that no matter how much distance they create, you'll always be there. They know you'll text them after a while. They assume you'll try to fix things when they pull away. They expect you to chase because in their subconscious mind, that's the role you've played. And as long as you continue playing that role, they remain comfortable, safe, unbothered. But the moment you disrupt that expectation, their world gets shaken. Think about it. If every time someone pushes you away, you reach back out, what message does that send? It tells them they have control. It tells them you are always available, always waiting. But if one day they pull back and instead of rushing in, you do nothing, suddenly the equation changes. They start wondering, wait, why didn't they reach out? Why aren't they chasing? What's happening? That moment of confusion is powerful because it forces them to think about you in a way they haven't before. Now, this isn't about playing games. This isn't about manipulation. It's about breaking a cycle that no longer serves you. It's about refusing to feed a pattern that leaves you feeling drained and unappreciated. When you stop responding the way they expect, they no longer have the upper hand. They can no longer take your presence for granted. Instead, they have to face a reality they've never considered before, the possibility of losing you. Most people don't give space long enough for this realization to sink in. They pull back for a day, maybe two, but the moment they feel uncomfortable, they rush back in, and guess what? The avoidant, they breathe a sigh of relief because their world is back in order. They dodge the discomfort. But when you hold your ground, when you allow them to sit in that uncertainty, you introduce a feeling they're not used to. And that feeling is what starts to shift the dynamic. You see, the mind craves certainty, but it is also drawn to challenge. The reason so many people fall into the trap of chasing and avoidant is that they mistake effort for connection. They think if I just show them how much I care, they'll finally see my worth. But the truth is, when someone expects you to be available, and you always are, they don't have to value. You become a constant, and constants fade into the background. But the moment you become unpredictable, when they can't quite figure you out, suddenly you become interesting. You become someone worth paying attention to. Now let's be clear, disrupting the pattern doesn't mean disappearing or acting out of character. It means shifting the energy. It means recognizing where you've been overextending and pulling that energy back into yourself. It means no longer making them the center of your emotional world. Instead of thinking about what they're doing, focus on yourself. Instead of wondering why they haven't reached out, ask yourself, why am I so focused on someone who isn't prioritizing me? That shift alone changes everything. People don't wake up and change overnight, but they do change when the environment around them changes. When you start showing up differently, they have no choice but to react differently. Maybe they reach out because they're confused. Maybe they test the waters to see if you'll return to the old pattern. Maybe they even pull away further, thinking you'll eventually break. But if you remain steady, if you keep showing up for yourself instead of them, their perception of you shifts. Suddenly, you're not the person who's always available. You're not the person they can put on a shelf and expect to be there when they feel like engaging. You become someone with value, someone they can't quite pin down, someone who has their own life, their own power, and that's unsettling. That's what makes them think. That's what forces them to reevaluate their position. You don't have to be cruel. You don't have to be distant just for the sake of it. But you do have to recognize that continuing to play a role that doesn't serve you only keeps you stuck. If you want to change the way someone treats you, you have to change the way you engage with them. And that starts with breaking the predictability they've come to rely on. Confidence changes everything. It's the difference between being an option and being a priority. It's the force that makes people stop and take notice. And when you show up with a level of certainty in yourself that an avoidant isn't used to, it disrupts their entire emotional framework. They expect hesitation. They expect insecurity. They expect you to seek validation from them. But when you flip that dynamic, when you walk in with the energy of someone who knows exactly who they are, suddenly they're the ones who feel unsteady. Avoidants operate in a space of control. They create distance because it makes them feel safe. They subconsciously expect their partners to lean in when they pull away, to overcompensate for the emotional gap they create. And for most people, that's exactly what happens. The more distant they become, the harder their partner works to prove their worth. But confidence shifts that balance entirely. When you radiate self-assurance, you send a completely different message. I don't need you to validate me. I'm already complete. That kind of presence is magnetic. Think about the people who command attention without even trying. They're not the ones chasing approval. They're not the ones bending over backward to accommodate someone who refuses to meet them halfway. They're the ones who move through the world with a sense of certainty as if they already know they're valuable. And because they believe it, others believe it too. Now let's be clear, this isn't about arrogance. Arrogance is rooted in insecurity. True confidence comes from a deep understanding of your own worth, independent of how anyone else sees you. It's about knowing that your presence is a gift, not a burden. And when you truly embody that, you stop tolerating behaviors that diminish your value. Avoidants are used to partners who try to prove themselves. They're used to people who second-guess their worth, who cling to every breadcrumb of affection they offer. But when you're confident, you don't play that game. You don't need to convince someone to choose you because you already know what you bring to the table. And that confidence is unsettling to someone who is used to holding the power. Think about it. If they've always had the upper hand in relationships, if they've always been the one deciding when to engage and when to pull back, what happens when you don't react the way they expect? What happens when, instead of seeking reassurance, you stand firm in your own presence? It forces them to see you differently. It forces them to question their own behavior. Confidence is also about the way you carry yourself. It's in your posture, your tone, the way you communicate. When you speak, do you do it with conviction? When you enter a room, do you own your space? When you engage with someone, do you do it from a place of self-assuredness or from a place of seeking approval? These details matter because people pick up on energy before they pick up on words. And when your energy exudes self-worth, it creates a shift. One of the most powerful things you can do in any relationship is hold your own emotional ground. When an avoidant distances themselves, instead of panicking or trying to pull them back in, you remain centered. Instead of internalizing their behavior as a reflection of your value, you recognize it as a reflection of their own fears and limitations. And because of that, you don't take it personally. That right there is power. Most people try to control an avoidant by convincing them to stay, by proving their loyalty, by making themselves smaller so the avoidant feels safe. But true influence doesn't come from forcing someone to stay. It comes from being someone they don't want to lose. And confidence is the foundation of that. When you know your worth, you stop chasing. When you know your worth, you stop explaining yourself to people who refuse to understand. When you know your worth, you become someone who naturally commands respect. And that's what leaves an avoidant emotionally unsettled. Not manipulation, not mind games, just the sheer fact that you are no longer operating from a place of need. You are no longer seeking their validation because you have already validated yourself. You are no longer adjusting yourself to fit into their comfort zone because you recognize that your presence is already enough. That's the shift. That's the moment. They realize they don't have the power they thought they did because confidence isn't just about how you act. It's about what you no longer tolerate. And when you stop tolerating inconsistency, when you stop accepting less than what you deserve, you force them to see you in a different light. You force them to question their own behavior, and in that moment, the entire dynamic begins to change. Relationships operate on energy exchanges. Whether you realize it or not, every interaction creates a rhythm, a give and take of attention, effort, and emotional investment. But when you're dealing with someone who has avoidant tendencies, that rhythm is often lopsided. You invest, they withdraw. You reach out, they hesitate. You open up, they shut down. And the more you try to bridge that emotional gap, the wider it seems to grow. And the reason for this is simple. Avoidants thrive on space. They feel safe when they have control over the level of intimacy in a relationship. The moment they sense someone getting too close, their natural instinct is to create distance. But here's the problem. Most people respond to that distance by pushing even harder. They send more messages, seek more reassurance, and try to pull the avoidant back in. And what does that do? It reinforces the avoidance behavior, making them retreat even further. But what happens when you stop? What happens when instead of leaning in, you lean back? Instead of closing the gap, you mirror their energy. That's when the real shift begins. Mirroring is one of the most powerful psychological tools you can use in any relationship. It taps into a person's subconscious, forcing them to confront the very behavior they're projecting. If an avoidant pulls away and you chase, they feel validated in their need for space. But if they pull away and you do the same, suddenly they're left with a void they weren't expecting. Think about it. If they're used to you always being available, always reaching out, always making the effort, then your absence is going to feel unfamiliar. And the human mind is drawn to the unfamiliar, especially when it disrupts an expected pattern. If they send a delayed, half-hearted response and you match that energy instead of overcompensating, it forces them to wonder, wait, what's happening here? If they stop initiating and you also stop initiating, they begin to notice the silence, and that silence can be deafening. Now, let's be clear. This isn't about playing games or trying to manipulate someone into chasing you. It's about balance. It's about breaking the unhealthy cycle of one person constantly giving while the other constantly withdraws. When you mirror an avoidance behavior, you're not being passive-aggressive or cold. You're simply reflecting the dynamic back at them so they can experience what it feels like. And that's where the discomfort comes in. Avoidants create distance because they assume the other person will always be there to fill the gap. But when you stop doing that, they're forced to sit in their own emotional space. For the first time, they experience what it feels like when someone doesn't overextend to accommodate them. And that realization can be deeply unsettling. This is the point where many avoidants start to shift. When they notice that you're no longer chasing, they begin to feel the absence of your energy. They start questioning why you're not responding the way they expected. They wonder if they've lost their hold over you, and in that moment, the power dynamic changes. But here's the key. You have to be consistent. Most people try mirroring for a few days, maybe a week, and then they get impatient. They think, okay, I pulled back, but they're still distant. Maybe I should just reach out. And the moment they do, they reinforce the old pattern. The avoidant breathes a sigh of relief because things are back to normal. But if you stay steady, if you truly match their energy without wavering, you force them to adapt. This doesn't mean you become cold or distant out of spite. It means you learn to regulate your emotional output based on what's being reciprocated. If they invest, you invest. If they withdraw, you give them space. This keeps the dynamic balanced and prevents you from overextending yourself in a way that drains you emotionally. And here's the unexpected part. Mirroring an avoidance energy doesn't just impact them, it impacts you. It forces you to recognize your own patterns. It makes you ask yourself, why have I been the one always doing the work in this relationship? Why have I been giving so much without getting the same in return? And once you see that, you start to reclaim your own power. This shift isn't just about making an avoidant unsettled. It's about teaching them and yourself what a balanced relationship should actually look like. When you stop doing all the emotional labor, you force the other person to step up or step out. Either way, you win. Because at the end of the day, a relationship should never be about one person constantly proving their worth while the other remains emotionally detached. It should be an equal exchange. And when you mirror an avoidance energy, you create the space for that balance to finally emerge. The way people perceive you directly affects how they treat you. If you position yourself as someone who is always available, always waiting, always prioritizing them over yourself, they will see you as someone they don't have to work for. But when you elevate yourself, when you become the kind of person that they fear losing, you completely shift the dynamic. Avoidants don't typically respond to words, they respond to shifts in energy. You can't convince them to appreciate you by explaining your worth. You can't talk them into treating you better. But what you can do is make yourself so valuable, so magnetic, that the idea of losing you becomes a risk they're not willing to take. And that starts with focusing on yourself. Too often people pour all their time and energy into trying to win over someone who is emotionally unavailable. They analyze every text, they replay conversations, they adjust their behavior in hopes of getting more validation. But all of that energy is being wasted in the wrong direction. Instead of putting that energy into them, put it into you. Ask yourself, what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of life do I want to live? What kind of energy do I want to bring into a room? When you start answering those questions and actually embodying that version of yourself, everything shifts. People value what they have to work for. It's a fundamental truth of human psychology. When something is too easy, it loses its appeal. Think about the things you've worked hardest for in life. Those are the things you cherish most. The same principle applies in relationships. If someone knows you will always be there, no matter how they treat you, there's no urgency for them to step up. But if they sense that you are someone who has options, who is constantly growing, who isn't waiting around for them to decide if they want you, that creates a different kind of response. One of the most powerful shifts you can make is to redirect your energy toward building yourself up instead of waiting for someone else to see your value. Elevating yourself means focusing on your own growth, your own passions, your own confidence. It means developing a lifestyle that is so fulfilling that anyone who wants to be in your life has to rise to your level. This isn't about faking it. It's not about pretending to be busy or trying to make them jealous. It's about actually becoming the person who doesn't tolerate low effort. When you do that, the way people interact with you changes naturally. The avoidant who once felt comfortable keeping you at arm's length now starts to sense that you are slipping through their fingers. And that is unsettling for them. Because here's the truth. Most avoidants expect people to chase them. They expect people to try harder when they pull away. But when you stop chasing and instead start thriving, they don't know what to do with that. Suddenly, they're the ones who feel uncertain. Suddenly, they're the ones questioning whether they're making a mistake. But here's the best part. By the time they realize what's happening, you'll have already built a life that fulfills you with or without them. You won't be waiting for their validation because you'll have already given it to yourself. You won't be hoping they change because you'll be too busy focusing on your own growth. And that's when the real power shift happens. Not because you manipulated them into wanting you, but because you became someone they can't afford to lose. When you elevate yourself, when you become the prize, you no longer have to wonder if someone will choose you. You already know your worth, and anyone who wants to be in your life has to step up and match your level, otherwise they simply don't belong there. Emotional distance is the avoidant's greatest weapon. It's how they maintain control in relationships, how they keep others at a comfortable arm's length. They don't do this out of malice, but as a deeply ingrained defense mechanism. Avoidants operate under the belief that emotional closeness is a risk, one that threatens their autonomy, their stability, and their sense of self. When they feel someone pulling them in, they instinctively retreat, not because they don't care, but because it disrupts the internal equilibrium they've built to protect themselves. Most people respond to this by trying harder. They seek reassurance, push for connection, and attempt to break through the emotional wall that the avoidant has built. But the more effort they put in, the more the avoidant withdraws. This creates a frustrating cycle where one person is always chasing while the other is always running. It's exhausting, unfulfilling, and leaves the person doing the chasing feeling unworthy and emotionally drained. But what happens when you disrupt this cycle? What happens when instead of chasing, you step back and create your own emotional distance? That's when everything changes. See, avoidants are comfortable in relationships where they hold the emotional power. They know how to handle a dynamic where someone else is pursuing them because they've spent their entire lives perfecting the art of maintaining distance. But they don't know how to handle someone who is no longer giving them that power. When you stop being the one to always reach out, when you stop being the one to initiate emotional conversations, when you stop making them the center of your world, they feel the shift. And that shift makes them uncomfortable because here's the truth. Avoidance don't actually want to lose the people who care about them. They want connection, but they want it on their terms. They want to feel safe while still having someone there who is willing to love them despite their walls. But when you create emotional distance, you introduce a reality they aren't prepared for, the possibility that you won't always be there. This is where the power dynamic begins to turn. At first, they might not react. They may even feel relieved that you're not pushing for closeness anymore. But over time, something deeper starts to happen. They begin to wonder why you've changed. They start to question whether you've lost interest, whether you've found someone else, whether they've misjudged your devotion to them. And here's the most important part. You are not doing this to manipulate them. You are doing this because you deserve to be in a relationship where the emotional effort is mutual. You are doing this because your energy, your time, and your emotional well-being matter just as much as theirs. Creating emotional distance isn't about trying to make them chase you. It's about protecting yourself from a one-sided relationship. When you pull back emotionally, you also give yourself the space to see things clearly. You start to recognize how much effort you've been putting in versus what you've been receiving. You begin to ask yourself if this is the kind of connection you truly want, or if you've simply been caught in a cycle of trying to prove your worth to someone who struggles to fully embrace intimacy. For the avoidant, your emotional distance does something they aren't used to. It forces them to confront their own feelings. When they feel the absence of your energy, they have to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty. They have to question whether they've made the right choices, whether their emotional barriers are really protecting them, or whether they're pushing away something they actually want. And that is what unsettles them. Not your anger, not your words, not your attempts to force them to open up, but the simple act of no longer being so emotionally available. When they realize they are no longer in control of the emotional dynamic, when they realize they no longer have the security of knowing you will always be there waiting, that's when the real shift happens. Some avoidants will try to test your boundaries. They'll pull away even more to see if you break and return to the old cycle. They might send mixed signals, reaching out just enough to keep you hooked, but not enough to truly change. But if you stay firm, if you continue valuing yourself and maintaining your emotional space, you send a clear message. I am not here to convince you of my worth. Either meet me halfway, or I will find someone who will. This is where true power lies, not in trying to change an avoidant, but in refusing to let their emotional distance dictate your self-worth. When you shift the focus back to yourself, when you create emotional distance, not as a game, but as an act of self-respect, you stop feeling powerless. You stop feeling like you're at their mercy. Instead, you become the one making the choice. And that choice is everything, because when you no longer give them the comfort of knowing they can always keep you at a distance without consequence, you force them to make a decision. They can either step up and meet you in a space of mutual effort and respect, or they can watch you walk away. Either way, you win, because your emotional well-being is no longer in their hands. It's in yours. One of the biggest mistakes people make in relationships with avoidance is falling into the trap of predictability. Avoidants thrive on a sense of control, and they maintain that control by creating emotional distance. They know exactly how their partners will react when they withdraw, usually with more effort, more reassurance, and more attempts to bridge the gap. This gives them a sense of security because they always know what to expect. But when you break that pattern, when you introduce an element of unpredictability, it forces them to rethink everything. Unpredictability does not mean playing games. It doesn't mean being inconsistent just for the sake of it, or purposely trying to confuse them. What it means is shifting out of the role they expect you to play. If they assume you will always be available, start prioritizing yourself more. If they think you will always be the one to initiate contact, pull back and let them be the one to reach out. If they expect you to tolerate their emotional distance without consequence, start setting boundaries that make it clear you won't settle for less than you deserve. This creates discomfort for the avoidant because it disrupts their sense of control. They have spent years perfecting their ability to manage intimacy and distance on their own terms. When someone challenges that system, when they are no longer the ones dictating the flow of the relationship, it forces them to confront their own behaviors in a way they are not used to. They start wondering why things feel different, why their usual strategies aren't working, why they no longer feel as secure in the dynamic. Unpredictability also means keeping your energy dynamic and expansive. Many people in relationships with avoidance shrink themselves down, making their entire emotional world revolve around the other person. They become predictable because they stop engaging with life outside of the relationship. But when you start investing in yourself, pursuing your passions, spending time with people who uplift you, engaging in activities that bring you joy, you naturally become more unpredictable. You are no longer someone who is just waiting around for them to decide how much attention they want to give. You are someone with a full and vibrant life, and that is something an avoidant doesn't expect. Avoidants often assume that their emotional distance will make you try harder. When you break that expectation, when you respond to their withdrawal not with desperation but with self-assurance, it throws them off balance. They start to realize that they no longer have full control over the relationship dynamic. They start to see that you are not someone who will endlessly wait for them to be ready. And that realization is unsettling for them. At first, they may test you. They may pull back even more to see if you will fall back into your old patterns. But if you remain steady, if you show them through your actions that you are not dependent on their emotional availability, It forces them to reconsider how they engage with you. They start to realize that they can't take your presence for granted. They start to feel the impact of your unpredictability, not as a punishment, but as a reflection of your self-worth. This is where the real shift happens. When an avoidant no longer feels certain that you will always be there, they have to make a choice. They can either step up and meet you at your level, or they can risk losing you entirely. And either way you win, because you are no longer playing by their rules. You are no longer waiting for them to change. You are living on your terms. And that is what ultimately leaves them emotionally unsettled. Avoidants often operate under the assumption that they have control over the emotional dynamic in a relationship. They are used to people adjusting to their distance, making accommodations for their hesitancy, and accepting less than full emotional engagement. But when you assert your standards, when you make it clear that you will not settle for a relationship that does not meet your needs, you completely disrupt that dynamic. Setting and enforcing standards is not about making demands or issuing ultimatums. It is about having a deep understanding of what you deserve and being unwavering in your commitment to that standard. It's about making it clear through your actions, not just your words, that you are not willing to remain in a relationship that does not fulfill you. This is where most people struggle. They may express what they need, but they don't follow through. They say they want consistency, but they tolerate inconsistency. They say they need emotional availability, but they stay even when it's not given. Avoidants recognize this. They sense when someone's boundaries are flexible, and they instinctively push those boundaries to see if they will hold. When you are firm in your standards, when you refuse to lower your expectations in the hopes that they will change, it forces them to see you differently. It forces them to recognize that you are not like the people who have tolerated their emotional distance in the past. And that realization is unsettling. This works because it shifts the responsibility back onto them. Avoidants are used to being in relationships where the other person does the emotional work, where they are the ones expected to be patient, to wait, to accept whatever level of closeness the avoidant is willing to offer. But when you stand firm in your standards, when you say, this is what I need, and I will not stay if I don't receive it, they are forced to make a choice. They can either step up and meet your standard, or they can watch you walk away. First, they may resist. They may try to convince you that you are asking for too much, that your expectations are unrealistic, that you should be more understanding. But this is simply a way to test whether or not you truly mean what you say. The key is to remain unwavering. Do not justify or negotiate your standards. Do not allow them to convince you that you should settle for less. The moment they realize that you are serious, that you are not afraid to walk away, they are confronted with something they are not used to: accountability. They are forced to confront their own patterns, to ask themselves whether they are willing to lose someone of value simply because they refuse to engage emotionally. And that moment of reckoning is deeply unsettling for them. But here's the most important part. Setting standards is not about making them change. It's about making sure that you don't settle. It's about recognizing that you deserve more than a relationship where you constantly have to fight for emotional crumbs. It's about understanding that love should be reciprocal, that your needs are just as important as theirs. When you hold firm to your standards, you regain your power. You stop feeling like you are at their mercy, waiting for them to decide if they want to be close to you or not. Instead, you become the one who chooses. You create a dynamic where they must prove that they are capable of being the kind of partner you deserve. And if they can't, then you walk away. Without hesitation, without fear, and without looking back. Because the moment you decide that you are worthy of more, you will never again accept less. At the end of the day, power in any relationship, especially one with an avoidant, comes down to self-respect. When you know your worth, when you stop chasing validation, and when you refuse to settle for emotional breadcrumbs, you shift the entire dynamic. Avoidants expect people to accommodate their distance, to wait patiently for them to be ready, to prove their value by overgiving. But when you flip the script, when you elevate yourself, when you create space, when you set firm standards, you force them to question everything they thought they could control. The goal is not to manipulate. It's not to win against them. The goal is to step into your own power so that their actions no longer dictate your sense of self-worth. When you do this, two things happen. Either they recognize that they must change and step up, or they let you go. And in that case, you freed yourself from a one-sided relationship that was never going to meet your needs. Either way, you win. Your happiness, your emotional security, your sense of self, they should never be dependent on someone else's ability to give you love. You deserve someone who meets you where you are, who chooses you fully, and who isn't afraid of emotional closeness. And if someone cannot give you that, then you owe it to yourself to walk away and create a life so fulfilling that you no longer need to look for validation from anyone else. Thank you for taking the time to invest in yourself, to listen, and to reflect on what it truly means to take back your power. Growth is never easy, but it is always worth it. Keep standing strong in your worth, keep demanding more from your relationships, and never forget that you are the prize. Thank you, and keep moving forward.